we continue Plutarch's Lives, and I like the icon a little bit squarer like that versus another print that this was in. Apparently this was... but somebody in their biography of Arthur Hugh Clough, the person who revised John Dryden's translation and organization, like he didn't have much to say. He didn't have many works after this work. I mean, over 1,300 pages in this thing if you include the introduction. Maybe it's closer to 1,400 if you include the index, but it's obvious. It's obviously utterly ridiculous to say he didn't do much. And, they were all smaller works, yes, but, poems and, anyway, of the other minor works, continuing his introduction, some look a good deal like lectures delivered at Rome and afterwards published with little dedications prefixed. We have a disquisition on the advantages we can derive from our enemies, addressed to Cornelius Pulcher, a discourse on fate, to Piso, on brotherly affection, and Nigrinus and Quintus. Many, however, are dialogues and conversations with a good deal of the same much varied scenery and exuberant detail which embellish the table talk, in a conversation which has been present at long ago when Nero was staying in Greece between Ammonius and some other friends. The meaning of the strange inscription at Delphi, the two letters EI, is debated. A visitor is conducted by some of Plutarch's friends over the sacred buildings at Delphi, and in the intervals between the somewhat tedious speeches of the professional guides who showed the sights, a discussion takes place on the nature of the oracles. It happened a little before the Pythian games in the time of Callistratus. There met us at Delphi two travelers from the extremities of the world. Demetrius, the grammarian, on his way home to Tarsus from Britain, and Cleombrotus, the Lacedaemonian, just returned from a long journey he's had made for his pleasure and instruction in Upper Egypt and far out into the Erythraean Sea. And so Daemon, as in the anti-personal self, not quite the same thing as the demon. The anti-personal self, of course, is the side that inherently goes after the other gender. You're born male, the female, not after, but the attraction, the pursuit, it includes the sexual side, but there's more than that to it. The question somehow or other occurs, and the dialogue of the cessation of oracles ensues, one passage of which is the famous story of the voice that proclaimed the death of the great Pan. Although Bullus is talking with Soclarus, the companion of his son, about an encomium which they had heard on hunting, the best praise they can give it is that it diverts into a less objectionable course the passion which finds one vent in seeing the contests of gladiators. Up come presently a large body of young men, lovers of hunting and fishing, and questions of the superior sagacity of land or of water animals is formally pleaded by two selected orators. Stories are told of elephants, and Aristotimus, the advocate of the land animals, relates a sight of the dog imitating in a play the effects of poison, which he himself says saw in Rome, and which was so perfectly acted as to cause himself being present here, rumbling the tumbler here. In the theater of Marcellus, it reads very much as if Plutarch and not Aristostimus had been the eyewitness. Well, I have to eat right after this, I guess. Something also of a personal remembrance of Vespasian's unrelatingly severe temper may be thought to appear in the story related in the dialogue on love of the Gaulish rebel Sabinus and his wife Eponina, mentioned by Tacitus in his histories, who, after living in an underground concealment several years, were discovered and put to death. 2 sons were born to them in their hiding place, one of whom, says Plutarch, was here with us in Delphi only a little while ago, and he is disposed, he adds, to attribute the subsequent extinction of the race of Vespasian to divine pleasure at this cruel and unfeeling act. People say unfeeling. Maybe that wasn't quite the point. Maybe it's even more feeling. Now, totally not the type, but it's like autism isn't robotic and not unfeeling or something. It's actually, the person is more aware of light, more aware of sound, more aware of social situations, and they get more emotion about it. Now, they get so emotional that things are overwhelming, that aren't overwhelming to other people, but they certainly have emotions. They're just not expressing it how other people would want them to express that. But, to some degree, everybody does that. Autobulus occurs again in the dialogue on love at the request of his friend Flavianus. He repeats a long conversation intended with curious incidents in which his father had taken part on Mount Helicon, once long ago before we were born, when he brought our mother after the dispute and variance which had arisen between their parents, that she might offer a sacrifice to love at the feast held at Thespia. The variance alluded to must clearly have been a fact, and in general, though these playful fictions or semi-fictions which form the machinery of the dialogues are not intended to be accepted in a literal way, they possess an authenticity which we cannot venture to attribute to the professedly historical statements about their author given in the latter writers. Suidas, the lexicographer, repeats a mere romance when he tells us that Trajan gave him the dignity of consul and issued orders that none of the magistrated in Illyria should do anything without consulting him. Suncellus, the Byzantine historian, under the record of one of the first years of Hadrian's reign, is equally or even more extravagant, relating that Plutarch, the philosopher of Chaeronea, was in his old age appointed by the emperor to the office of governor of Greece, though the period of Trajan and that Trajan, maybe in Greek it has that Trajan and the Antonines was the golden age of philosophers, whose brief persecution under Domitian seems to have won them, for a while, a sort of spiritual supremacy, superior to that which, after Diocletian, was wrestled from them by ministers of the new religion. Still, these assertions are in the face of them entirely incredible. Now, I guess some of the pronunciation issues could come from the fact that in English, we, you know, don't speak as phonetically. Things are alphabetic, and we have all sorts of spellings for some stuff. I mean, all sorts of ways of saying even like the same spelling sometimes. There is a letter indeed given among Plutarch's printed works, in which a collection of sayings of kings and commanders is dedicated to Trajan, and though much doubt is entertained, it is not at all improbable that it is Plutarch's own writing. There is nothing remarkable in its contents, and it is most noticeable for the contrast in tone which it presents to another letter, undoubtedly spurious, first published in Latin by John of Salisbury, which is a very preceptorial lecture to Trajan, his pupil by Plutarch, his supposed former teacher. A list of Plutarch's works, including many of which nothing remains, is also given by Suidas, was made by Lamprias, Plutarch's son, and a little prefatory letter to a friend whom he had known in Asia, and who had written to ask for the information. Well, in Asia, not quite the same as what we'd call Asia, and but I guess that's part of why they moved the definition of the continent. It used to be, okay, the Persian, over by Afghanistan, and then everything everywhere west was, the Europe side. But they kind of decided this one area, Asia, is what we're going to name everything east of its side, rather than, the Hindus, 4 tribes, the Persians, 1 tribe, and that being the division there. And who had written to ask for the information is prefixed to the catalogue. The catalogue itself may be correct enough, but the name of Lamprias occurs nowhere in all Plutarch's extant works as that of one of his sons, and it cannot but be suspected that this family name was adopted, and this letter to the nameless friend in Asia composed by some grammarian long after, who desired to give interest to an ordinary list of the author's extant writings. In a reading of Plutarch, the following points should be remembered. He is a moralist rather than an historian. His interest is less for politics and the changes of the empires, and much more for personal character and individual actions and motives to action, duty performed and rewarded, arrogance chastised, hasty anger corrected, humanity, fair dealing, and generosity triumphing in the visible are relying on the invisible world. His mind in his biographies, in his biographic memoirs, is continually running on the Aristotelian ethics, on the high Platonic theories, which form the religion of the educated population of his time. The time itself is a second point, that of Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian, the commencement of the best and happiest age of the great Roman imperial period, the social system spreading over all the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, of which Greece and Italy were the centers, and to which the East and the furthest known West were brought into relation, had then reached its highest mark of advancement and consummation. The laws of Rome and the philosophy of Greece were powerful from the Tigris to the British Islands. It was the last great era of Greek and Roman literature. Epictetus was teaching in Greek the virtues which Marcus Aurelius was to illustrate as emperor. Dio Chrysostom and Arrian were recalling the memory of the most famous Attic rhetoricians and historians, and while Plutarch wrote in Chaeronea, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Martial, and Juvenal were writing at Rome. It may be said, too, that perhaps not untruly, that the Latin, the metropolitan writers less faithfully represented the general spirit and character of the time than what came from the pen of a simple Boeotian provincial, writing in a more universal language and unwarped by the strong local reminiscences of the old home of the Senate and the Republic. Tacitus and Juvenal have more, perhaps, of the antique Rome than the citizen of the Mediterranean Empire. The evils of the imperial government, as felt in the capital city, are depicted in the Roman prose and verse more vividly and more vehemently than suits a general representation of the state of the imperial world, even under the rule of Domitian himself. It is, at any rate, the serener aspect and the better era that the life and writings of Plutarch reflect. His language is that of a happy man in himself and in what is around him. His natural cheerfulness is undiminished. His easy and joyous simplicity is unimpaired. His satisfactions are not saddened or embittered by any overpowering recollections of years past under the immediate present terrors of imperial wickedness, though he could also remember Nero, and had been a man when Domitian was an emperor. The utmost we can say is that he shows perhaps the instructed happiness of one who had lived into good times out of evil, and that the very vigor of his content proves that its roots were fixed amongst circumstances not too indulgent or favorable. Much has been said of Plutarch's inaccuracy. It cannot be denied that he is careless about numbers and occasionally contradicts his own statements. A greater fault, perhaps, is his passion for anecdote. He cannot forbear from repeating stories, the improbability of which he is the first to recognize, which nevertheless by mere repetition leaves unjust impressions. He is unfair in this way to Demosthenes and to Pericles, against the latter of whom, however, he doubtless inherited the prejudices which Plato handed down to the philosophers. It is true also that his unhistorical treatment of the subjects of his biography makes him often unsatisfactory and imperfect in the portraits he draws. Much, of course, in the public lives of statesmen can find its only explanation in their political position, and of this Plutarch often knows and thinks little, so far as the researches of modern historians have succeeded in really recovering a knowledge of relations of this sort. So far, undoubtedly, these biographies stand in need of their correction, yet in the uncertainty which must attend all modern restorations, it is agreeable and surely also profitable to recur to the portraits drawn ere new thoughts and views had occupied the civilized world, without preference to such disputable grounds of judgment, simply upon the broad principles of the ancient moral code of right and wrong. And see, just like the writers of the Bible, they arrange their history, you could say, based on not just collections, but, underlying principle. Making some little deductions in cases such as those that have been mentioned, allowing for a little overlap of story, and from some considerable quasi-religious hostility to the democratic leaders who excited the scorn of Plato. If we bear in mind also that in narratives like that of Theseus, he himself confesses his inability to disengage fact from fable. It may be said in Plutarch's Lives that readers of all ages will find instructive and faithful biographies of the great men of Greece and Rome, or at any rate, if in Plutarch's time it was too late to think of really faithful biographies, we have here in faithful record of the historical tradition of his age. That is what, in the 2nd century of our era, Greeks and Romans loved to believe about their warriors and statesmen of the past, as a picture at least of the best Greek and Roman moral views and moral judgments, as a presentation of the results of Greek and Roman moral thought, delivered not under the pressure of calamity, but as they existed in ordinary times and actuated plain living people in country places in their daily life. Plutarch's writings are of indisputable value. It may be said also that Plutarch's character as depicted in them possesses a natural charm of pleasantness and amiability which is not easy to match among all extant classical writers. And while you don't have some of the historical issues, you could say, with the, with the hadith collections, I mean, a hadith, it's more varied than that, but I mean, oversimplification of this is Herodotus is also the historical figure, but Herodotus shares everything. In the Muslim world, it's like here's the chain, and what do we know about the people on the chain of transmission, and how does this match up with other stuff? So a lot of the the more known ones tended to pretty much not include everything. Not that it wasn't probably the case, but they tended to exclude things. But you see, variations. Plutarch is more concerned about, rather than a jumble of, all this stuff's being said, no matter how, Plutarch is sort of the synoptic sort of thing. So people who read the Bible and look over the, try to make a single story, ignoring the contradictions and some other issues like that, and directing it towards principles, so therefore some things would be ignored, right? But I would say that Plutarch's more historical than, anything in what would be called the New Testament, certainly. A lot of what we call in tonic, but anyways, the present translation is a revision of that published at the end of the 17th century, and this was published in 1864, with a life of Plutarch written by Dryden, whose name it was presumed would throw some reflected luster on the humbler workmen who performed, better or worse, the more serious labor. There is, of course, a great inequality in their work, but the translation by Langhorne, for which, in the middle of the last century, the older times were discarded, it is so inferior in liveliness, and is in fact so dull and heavy a book, that, in default of an entirely new translation, some advantage, it is hoped, may be gained by the revival here attempted. It will not have been needed had Mr. Long not limited the series which he published, with very useful notes in Mr. Knight's Shilling Library, to the lives connected with the civil wars of Rome. Dryden's Life of Plutarch is, like many of Dryden's writings, hasty yet well written, inaccurate but agreeable to read. That, by Dacier, printed in the last volume of his Dossier, is it Dossier? Is that how you say that? and his last volume of his French translations is, in many respects, very good. The materials for both were collected, and the references accumulated by Rualdus in his laborious life appended to the old Paris folios of 1624. But everything that is of any value is given in the articles in Fabricius's Bibliotheca Graeca, and with the most recent editions in Paul's German Cyclopaedia. Much that is useful is found, as might be expected, in Clinton's Faste Romana, from which the following table is taken. And 41 to 67, we have Seneca, Lucan, and Persius as authors we can refer to. And the occurrences of 41 of the Common Era, the accession of Claudius, 54, accession of Nero, 66, Nero comes into Greece, alluded to in Plutarch's dialogue on the EI at Delphi. 67, Nero celebrates the Isthmian Games, alluded to in Plutarch's Lives of Flaminius. Now, the next set of brackets doesn't include the other three, so 68, Galba is emperor, civil wars. 69, Vitellius, Otho, Vespasian. 70, the taking of Jerusalem. And notice that all the canonical Gospels occur by people who didn't witness that. Or, that they waited until after that. Even the writings of Paul, we don't have any from that period. Any of those letters, we don't have any fragment of any of the versions from that period, which is very interesting because, some of the claims about the ancestry and all that. But 74 and 79, the death of Pliny the Elder is listed in the author section. We have 74, the philosophers are expelled from Rome. 79, the death of Sabinus the Gaul, death of Vespasian, the accession of Titus, eruption of Vesuvius, alluded to by Plutarch as a recent occurrence in his inquiry why the Pythian oracles are no longer delivered in verse. 81, the accession of Domitian, and 90, the philosophers are again expelled from Rome after the death of Rusticus. And to those last two items, we have Quintilian, Statius, Silius, Italicus, Martial, and the notes for 96, 217, the occurrences listed. We have Dio Chrysostom Tacitus, born about 60 of the Common Era, Plutarch, Epictetus, Arrian, Pliny the Younger, born in 61 of the Common Era, Juvenal, born in 59 of the Common Era, Favorinus, Suetonius, born about 70 of the Common Era. So the occurrences listed, we have 96, accession of Nerva, 98, accession of Trajan, 100, Pliny's panegyric, and to give context to some other stuff, that was when Apollonius Christ died, and they waited a full 20 years for 20 years or so before starting to write other than John and the book of the Revelations, the other, the book of Acts and some of the other parts of the Bible. Because historically you can say that Apollonius was weaved into Paul and the Jesus character. Jesus. All right. Well, you can put the ending of the N or PS or, Anyways, 103, Epictetus is teaching at Nicopolis. Arrian attending him, 104. Pliny in Bithynia, 106. Trajan winters on the Danube, alluded to by Plutarch on the principle of cold, 113. Erection of Trajan's column, 114. Trajan's Parthian victories. Plutarch had written his life of Antony before these, 117. Accession of Hadrian. In Hadrian's third year, Plutarch, according to Eusebius, was still alive, and these last three we have Ptolemy, Appian, Pausanias, Galen, Locian, Athenaeus, Dion Cassius as authors. And remember, Ptolemy was somebody who knew where Atlantis was. So did Herodotus. It was centered in, it wasn't some undersea kingdom or whatever people say. At least not what they mean by Atlantis, right? The Greco-Roman world. But people certainly repeat that a lot, Oh yeah, by the way, the Eye of the Sahara in northwest Africa is really the center. It has the same dimensions. There's that cultural influence that it could have been one general culture across the whole of North Africa. But anyways, that's another point. No, the authors whose names are printed in italics are Greek writers. And the fault which runs through all the earlier biographies, from that of Rualdus downward, is the assumption wholly untenable that Plutarch passed many years, as many perhaps as 40 at Rome. The entire character of his life is, of course, altered by such an impression. It is, therefore, not worthwhile reprinting here the life originally prefixed by Dryden to the translations, which, more or less of alteration, follow in the present volumes. One or two characteristic extracts may be sufficient. The first may throw some light on a subject which to modern readers is a little obscure. Dryden is wrong in one or two less important points, but his general view of the daemonic belief which pervades Plutarch's writings is tolerably to the purpose. Of course, the Christian world, they demonize the daemon. And I guess we're going to have to stop here for